On the night of July 11th, 1944, a German infantry platoon dug into the northern slope of Hill 192, south of St. Lo, France, heard nothing. No ranging shot, no whistle of an incoming round climbing overhead, no dull crump of a single shell landing short, which is the sound every frontline soldier in every army has learned to read. The sound that says, "Get down, they're finding you, more is coming." There was none of that. What there was everything at once. 144 shells from 12 batteries, some 5 miles behind the American line, some 9, some firing from positions the Germans didn't even know existed, struck an area the size of 2 football fields in the same 3 seconds. The concussion was not a sequence. It was a wall. Men who had survived Kursk, who had lived through Soviet artillery preparations that lasted hours, who knew the difference between a harassing fire and a barrage, had never experienced anything like this. A Soviet barrage was a storm you could endure. You heard it build. You pressed yourself into the earth and waited. Eventually it shifted, or it stopped, and you stood up and fought. This could not be endured, because there was nothing to endure. There was no first second. There was no warning second. There was only the last second, the one where every shell in the sky arrived at the same coordinate at the same moment, and the men who were standing when it began were no longer standing when it ended. And then it stopped. And then, 4 minutes later, it happened again. A different grid square, the same impossible simultaneity. German prisoners taken from that sector in the days that followed told American intelligence officers the same thing. They used different words, but the meaning was identical. The American artillery was not more powerful than what they had faced in Russia. It was not louder. It was not more persistent. It was something else entirely. It was precise in a way that felt wrong. It arrived without a prologue, and it coordinated across distances that should have made coordination impossible. One phrase appeared in enough interrogation transcripts to become a pattern. German officers, trained professionals who understood artillery as well as anyone alive, called the American method unfair. If you're finding value in this investigation, a like and a subscribe help these stories reach the audience they deserve. Here is what's strange about that word: unfair. German officers did not use it about the American Air Force, which owned the sky. They did not use it about American tanks, which outnumbered theirs 5-1. They used it about artillery, the one arm where, on paper, the two sides were nearly equal. German and American divisions carried similar guns, similar calibers, similar ranges, similar ammunition. A German 105mm howitzer could throw a shell nearly as far as an American 105, and it hit just as hard when it landed. So what made the difference? What turned two roughly equal artillery arms into a mismatch so lopsided that a German field marshal, Erwin Rommel himself, wrote in his reports from Normandy, "Also in evidence is their great superiority in artillery and outstandingly large supply of ammunition." Part of the answer was ammunition. The Americans simply had more of it. Part of the answer was air observation. Little Piper cubs circling over the German lines, spotting targets the guns couldn't see. Part of the answer was the Fire Direction Center, a system born at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the early 1930s that let one forward observer call the fire of an entire battalion, or 2 battalions, or 5, through a single radio call. But none of those things explained the one detail that German officers kept coming back to in their interrogation transcripts. Not the volume, not the accuracy, the timing. The impossibility that shells fired from batteries miles apart at different elevations with different powder charges and different barrel lengths and different distances to the target could arrive at the same spot in the same 3-second window. That timing, the thing the Americans called time on target, rested on something so ordinary that no history of World War II has ever put it on the cover. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a machine. It was something every American soldier carried on his wrist, and something the German army could not put on the wrists of its men, no matter how hard it tried. But before we get to what it was, you need to understand what artillery looked like without it. Because the old way of doing things had a flaw that everyone knew about, that cost thousands of lives, and that no army had been able to fix for 25 years. The flaw was simple, and it was lethal. But not for the people you'd expect. In the autumn of 1918, on the Western Front, American and French artillery hammered German positions for hours before every major assault. Thousands of guns, millions of shells. The bombardments were staggering in their scale and absolutely predictable in their rhythm. The first shell landed. The Germans heard it. They dropped. They crawled into dugouts, pressed themselves into trenches, pulled overhead cover across their holes. And then they waited while the rest of the barrage chewed up empty ground above their heads. A study conducted after the armistice measured what every frontline soldier already knew. When the first shell of a bombardment lands, roughly 58% of the men in the target area are still standing. 2 seconds later, only 29% remain upright. After 8 seconds, every single man is prone, in cover, or dead. The killing window is not minutes. It is seconds. And every shell that arrives after those first 8 seconds is hitting dirt, not men. This was the arithmetic that haunted artillery officers between the wars. You could fire 10,000 shells, but if they arrived one battery at a time, the way every army on Earth fired them, the first few shells screamed a warning to every man within earshot, and the rest of the bombardment became an expensive landscaping project. The Germans called it Trommelfeuer, drum fire. It sounded terrifying. It cratered fields, it collapsed trenches, it shattered eardrums, and drove men mad. But it did not kill nearly as many soldiers as its fury suggested, because human beings can press themselves flat in under 2 seconds when their survival depends on it. The Americans came home from France in 1919 knowing this, and at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a small group of officers spent the next 15 years trying to solve it. The man who started the work was Major Carlos Brewer. He arrived at the gunnery department in the late 1920s and began dismantling the way American batteries aimed and fired. In the old system, each battery commander controlled his own guns, spotted his own fall of shot from a crude observation tower near the gun line, and corrected his own fire. If a division wanted to mass the fire of multiple batteries on one target, which everyone agreed was the point of artillery, each battery commander had to see the same target, calculate his own solution, and fire on his own schedule. The result was exactly what you'd expect. Shells arrived in a ragged sequence, battery by battery, spread across 30 seconds or a minute, giving the enemy all the time in the world to find cover. Brewer's successor, Major Orlando Ward, took the idea further. Ward built what he called the Fire Direction Center, a single tent, a single map, a single team of men with protractors and slide rules who could take a target location from a forward observer and compute firing data for every gun in a battalion simultaneously. One observer, one radio call, 12 guns responding as one. Remember that phrase, 12 guns responding as one. Because it sounds like the answer. It sounds like the system that turned American artillery into something the Germans called unfair. It wasn't. Not yet. The Fire Direction Center solved the brain problem. It solved the math. A lieutenant on a hilltop with a radio could now call 6 digits into his handset, and within minutes, the FDC could calculate range, azimuth, elevation, and powder charge for every howitzer in the battalion. If the division artillery commander wanted more weight on the target, the FDC could push the call up to the next echelon, and adjacent battalions could add their guns. By the time the United States entered the war, a single forward observer could theoretically summon the fire of every gun in the division, 48 howitzers, sometimes more, onto a single grid square. Theoretically. Because there was still the timing problem. 12 guns at the same distance from the target can fire simultaneously. You shout "fire," and every lanyard pulls at once. But 12 guns are never at the same distance. In a real tactical deployment, batteries are scattered across miles of terrain. One battery might be 4,000 yards from the target, another might be 7,000, a third might be 9,000. The shell from the close battery takes 11 seconds to arrive. The shell from the far battery takes 23. If they all fire at the same moment, the shells land 12 seconds apart, and 12 seconds is an eternity. The close battery's shells scream the warning. By the time the far battery's shells arrive, every man in the target zone is flat in a hole. To make the shells land together, you have to do the math backward. You calculate the flight time for each battery. The battery with the longest flight time fires first. The battery with the shortest flight time fires last. If every battery fires at exactly the right second, not the right minute, the right second, the shells converge from different directions at different speeds along different arcs and strike the target in the same 3-second window. The Americans called this technique time on target, TOT. On paper, TOT was elegant. In practice, it required something that no army in 1941 possessed in sufficient quantity, and that one army, specifically, could not possess at all. Not because the technology didn't exist, but because of a choice made in peacetime about who in the ranks deserved to know what time it was. The problem was not complicated. A private pulling a lanyard on a 105mm howitzer needed to pull it at a specific second. Not a specific minute, a specific second. If the FDC sent the order, fire at 08:59 and 42 seconds, the man at the gun had to know to the second what time it was. This meant he needed a watch. Not a good watch, not an expensive watch. A watch that could be synchronized with every other watch in the battalion, that kept time within 30 seconds a day, and that a 20-year-old kid from Iowa who had been a gas station attendant 4 months ago could read in the dark, in the rain, with mud on his hands, and shells going off around him. In the early 1940s, the United States had something that no other nation on Earth possessed: a watch industry built for mass production. Elgin, Illinois, Waltham, Massachusetts, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, New York City. 4 companies, Elgin, Waltham, Hamilton, and Bulova, that between them had been making watches for the American market since the Civil War. They knew how to build precision movements on assembly lines. They knew how to stamp cases from base metal instead of machining them from steel. They knew how to train women on factory floors to assemble a movement in minutes, not hours. In 1940, the War Department released Specification 55-1B. It called for a wristwatch with a 7-joule movement, a black dial with luminous hands and markers, accuracy within 30 seconds per day, and a price the government could afford to put on the wrist of every soldier who needed one. The Ordnance Department watch, the ORD, was not beautiful. It was not prestigious. Collectors today call it the plain one, the one without the sweep second hand, the one that nobody photographs for magazine covers. It was a tool. And Bulova, Elgin, Hamilton, and Waltham made them in numbers that stagger. Then, in 1943, the War Department issued a second specification, the A11. This one was stricter: 15 joules minimum, dust-proof or waterproof casing, temperature resistance, a power reserve of at least 30 hours, and one feature that changed the war: a hacking movement. Hacking meant that when you pulled out the winding crown, the second hand stopped, dead. It did not coast forward. It did not drift. It froze in place. And it stayed frozen until you pushed the crown back in, at which point it began moving again from exactly where it had stopped. This is why the scene from every war movie, the officer saying, "Gentlemen, synchronize your watches," actually mattered. With a hacking movement, a sergeant could call out the time hack over a field telephone. Stand by. Hack. And every man in the battery pulled his crown at the same instant, set his minute hand, waited for the second hand to reach 12, and pushed the crown back in. Every watch in the battalion was now synchronized to within a second. Over 1 million A11 watches came off American production lines during the war. Elgin, Waltham, and Bulliva built them in such volume that the A11 earned a nickname that stuck for 80 years, the watch that won the war. Add the ORD watches, the Navy watches, the Marine Corps watches, the pocket watches still used by some NCOs, and the personal timepieces that soldiers bought with their own money before shipping out, and by 1944, the American Army in Europe was the most time-synchronized fighting force in human history. Now hold that picture in your mind and cross the line. A German artilleryman, winter of 1944. He serves a 10 5mm howitzer in a battery attached to an infantry division in Normandy. His gun is the Leff H-18, a fine weapon, reliable, accurate, with a range nearly equal to its American counterpart. His crew is experienced. They have been fighting since Kursk, some since France in 1940. They know how to lay their gun, load, and fire as fast as any crew in any army. But when the battery commander gives the order to fire, the battery commander is the only man at the gun position who knows what second it is, because the battery commander is the only man who has a watch. German military watches were issued through a system that treated timepieces the way the Wehrmacht treated binoculars and map cases, as equipment for officers and senior NCOs. The watches were recorded in a soldier's paybook by serial number. They were government property, to be returned upon discharge. They were manufactured under contract by Swiss and German firms in quantities that never came close to meeting demand. The lower enlisted ranks, the men who actually loaded the shells and pulled the lanyards, could not afford a watch on their pay, and their duties, in the eyes of the system that supplied them, rarely required one. This meant something very specific for German artillery. A German battery could fire on command. It could fire accurately. It could fire rapidly. What it could not do, reliably, was fire at a precise second, coordinated with batteries it could not see, commanded by officers it had never met, miles away across terrain it did not know. Because the synchronization chain broke at the point where it mattered most, the man at the gun. The American advantage was not a secret weapon. It was not a breakthrough in physics. It was a $2 watch on the wrist of a corporal from Nebraska, and a German system that had decided, years before the war, that corporals did not need to know what time it was. But knowing the time was only half of the equation. Turning 1 million synchronized watches into the most feared artillery technique of the war required one more thing, and the man who figured it out learned his lesson the hard way, on an island most Americans had never heard of. Guadalcanal, February 1943. The island was supposed to be secure by now. The Marines who had landed the previous August had held Henderson Field through months of Japanese naval bombardment, jungle fighting, and supply crises that left them eating 2 meals a day. But the Japanese garrison had not been destroyed. It had retreated into the interior, into ridges and ravines covered by triple canopy jungle so dense that a man standing 10 yards away was invisible. The Army's 25th Infantry Division, under Major General J. Lawton Collins, was sent to finish the job. Collins was 46, a West Pointer with sharp features and a reputation for moving fast. The troops called him Lightning Joe, and the name was not ironic. He had studied at the Industrial War College, served in staff positions that taught him how large formations worked, and arrived on Guadalcanal with ideas about artillery that his gunners had never tried under fire. The problem Collins faced was one that artillery officers had been discussing in theory for a decade, but had never solved in combat. How to drop the full weight of every available gun onto a single target so that the Japanese had no time to react. On Guadalcanal, the jungle made air observation nearly useless. Forward observers on the ground could see only yards in front of them. Targets appeared and vanished. A Japanese machine gun nest might fire for 30 seconds and then go silent. its crew invisible under roots and earth. By the time a single battery found the range and walked its shells onto the position, the Japanese had moved. Collins wanted something different. He wanted every gun in his division artillery, and if possible, guns borrowed from adjacent units, to fire at a single grid square and have every shell arrive at the same moment. Not the same minute, the same moment. His artillery staff had the math. The Fire Direction Center, the system born at Fort Sill, gave them the ability to compute simultaneous firing data for multiple batteries at different ranges. But the math only worked if the batteries could synchronize their firing times to the second. And that meant the man pulling the lanyard at Battery A, 4,000 yards from the target, and the man pulling the lanyard at Battery C, 7,000 yards away, had to agree on exactly what second it was, and both had to be right. They were right because both men had watches. Cheap, government-issue, hacking movement watches that had been synchronized that morning against the same time signal. The watches didn't care that the men wearing them were standing in mud, that the humidity was destroying everything else they owned, that the nearest watchmaker was 6,000 miles away. They kept time within 30 seconds a day. And 30 seconds a day, over the span of a few hours between the morning synchronization and an afternoon fire mission, meant an error of maybe 2 seconds. 2 seconds was inside the 3-second TOT window. On Guadalcanal, Collins's gunners proved that the theory worked. Massed fires, every tube in range, shells converging on a single point in a single instant, shattered Japanese positions that had survived days of conventional bombardment. The jungle splintered. Bunkers collapsed. Men who had endured hours of sequential shelling were killed in the opening second of a TOT strike, because there was no opening second. There was only the second. Collins noticed something else. When his forward observers called a TOT mission, the Japanese did not adapt. They could not adapt. Every lesson the Japanese had learned about surviving artillery, dig deeper, spread out, wait for the pause, was useless against a technique that eliminated the pause entirely. There was no first shell to hear. There was no sequence to read. There was only silence, and then everything. He carried that lesson out of the Pacific and into the most important job of his career. In the spring of 1944, Collins took command of 7th Corps in England. His corps would assault Utah Beach on D-Day and then drive west to capture Cherbourg. He brought with him a staff that understood TOT, forward observers who had called it in jungle and open ground, and an absolute conviction that massed, time-on-target artillery was the single greatest advantage the American Army possessed over the Wehrmacht. He was about to find out how right he was. And also how much further the technique could go. Because in France, Collins would not have the 48 guns of a single division's artillery. He would have 258, 16 battalions. Guns spread across 20 miles of Norman countryside, firing from orchards and hedgerow fields and church courtyards, all of them connected by radio to fire direction centers that could push a call from a single lieutenant on a hilltop to every gun in the corps. But 258 guns, synchronizing their fire to the same 3-second window, required something that 48 guns on Guadalcanal did not. It required not just that every gun crew had a watch. It required that every watch in the corps agreed with every other watch in the corps. Across 20 miles, across 16 separate battalions, each of which had synchronized its own watches at a different time of morning, against a different time signal, with a different accumulated error. The margin was 3 seconds. The distance was 20 miles. And the solution, when it came, was so simple that it barely qualified as technology at all. The solution was a radio signal. Every morning, a time hack was broadcast on a known frequency. Every fire direction center in the corps picked it up. Every battery synchronized its watches against it. And because every watch in the American Army had the same hacking movement, pull the crown, the hand stops, push the crown, the hand moves, A sergeant in a hedgerow battery near Sainte-Mère-Église and a sergeant in a gun pit 11 miles south of him could both set their watches to the same second, within the same margin, using the same procedure that took less than 30 seconds to perform. There was nothing secret about this. It was printed in field manuals. It was practiced in training. It was so mundane, so ordinary, that no officer wrote home about it and no correspondent filed a story on it. 1 million men pulling out their watch crowns every morning was not news. It was like lacing boots or filling canteens. Something the Army did because the Army did it. But think about what it meant. A forward observer, a lieutenant usually, sometimes a sergeant, crouched behind a stone wall outside a Norman village with a pair of binoculars and an SCR 610 radio. He sees a German infantry company forming up in a tree line 800 yards away. They are preparing to counterattack. He has maybe 5 minutes before they move. He calls his battalion FDC, 6 digits, grid coordinates. The FDC plots the target on their firing chart, computes the data for their own 3 batteries, 12 guns, and simultaneously pushes the call upward to division artillery. The division FDC looks at the map, sees that 2 adjacent battalions can range the same target, and pushes the call to them. Within 90 seconds of the observer's first transmission, 3 battalions, 36 guns, have firing solutions. The FDC computes the time of flight for each battery, works backward from a designated impact time, say 09:14 and 30 seconds, and tells each battery exactly when to fire. Battery A, your flight time is 14 seconds. Fire at 09:14 and 16 seconds. Battery B, your flight time is 19 seconds. Fire at 09:14 and 11 seconds. Battery F, 12 miles away, your flight time is 26 seconds. Fire at 09:14 and 4 seconds. Each battery commander looks at his watch. Each gun crew chief looks at his watch. At the designated second, not minute, second, the lanyard pulls. 36 guns fire in a ragged sequence that sounds like chaos, some firing a full 20 seconds before others, the sound rolling across the Norman countryside in no pattern that makes tactical sense to anyone listening. And then, at 09:14 and 30 seconds, 36 shells arrive at the same tree line in the same 3-second window. The German company that was forming up for a counterattack ceases to exist. Not as a fighting unit, as a physical fact. Men who were standing are no longer standing. Men who were moving are no longer moving. There is no sequence to take cover from because there is no sequence. During the fighting for Hill 192 outside Saint-Lô, the 2nd Infantry Division fired as many as 20 TOT missions in a single night. 20 times between dusk and dawn, the sky over the German positions split open without warning and slammed shut in the same breath. German prisoners taken from that sector were not just demoralized, they were disoriented. Several told interrogators they believed the Americans possessed a new weapon, something that made all the shells land at once. They did not understand how conventional artillery could produce the effect they had experienced. It did not match anything in their training. It did not match anything from the Eastern Front. Because on the Eastern Front, Soviet artillery was fearsome, but it was sequential. A Soviet barrage began, and you heard it begin. You pressed yourself into the earth, and you survived, or you didn't. But there was a structure to it, a rhythm you could read, a duration you could estimate, a pause you could anticipate. American TOT had no structure. It had no rhythm. It had no beginning. It had only the middle. And the middle was everything arriving at once. And here is the detail that no German interrogation report says outright, but that sits underneath every one of them like a foundation stone. The German army could not do this. Not because German artillery officers didn't understand the math. They understood it fine. Not because German guns couldn't shoot accurately. They could. Not because the German army lacked radios or fire direction procedures. It had both, though its system was less centralized than the American one, more reliant on the individual battery commander, more dependent on wire communication that broke under bombardment. The German army could not do TOT because it could not synchronize the watches of men who didn't have watches. A German battery commander wore a watch. His officers might wear watches, but the Kanonier, the gunner, the loader, the man who set the fuse and pulled the lanyard, did not. And even if the battery commander shouted the firing second to his crew, that only synchronized one battery. To synchronize 16 battalions across 20 miles, you needed the second-to-second agreement of hundreds of men at hundreds of guns, and every one of them had to know, independently and simultaneously, what time it was. The Americans had that. The Germans did not. And the gap between those two facts was measured in the cheapest piece of equipment the United States Army issued to its soldiers. But the watches were about to enable something even more devastating than shells arriving on time. Because in the winter of 1944, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, American artillerymen received a new kind of ammunition. And when they combined it with TOT, the result was so terrifying that German soldiers walked into the barrage with their hands up, screaming a single word. December 16th, 1944. 3 German armies, 250,000 men, more than 1,000 tanks, hit the American line in the Ardennes along an 80-mile front. The offensive was planned in total secrecy. It achieved complete surprise. The weakest sector of the American line, held by 2 green divisions and 2 exhausted ones, buckled, then broke. Roads clogged with retreating trucks and half-tracks. Headquarters scrambled to move west. The first 72 hours were chaos. And in that chaos, American artillery did something it had never done before. Not because someone ordered it, but because the system, the watches, the FDCs, the radios, the synchronized clocks ticking in unison across hundreds of gun positions, allowed it to happen without orders. At Monschau, on the northern shoulder of the German penetration, the 38th Cavalry Squadron was dug in and about to be overrun. The cavalrymen were lightly armed. They had jeeps and machine guns, not tanks. The German infantry pushing toward them outnumbered them badly. The squadron commander called for artillery support. The call went to the 406th Artillery Group, commanded by Colonel George Axelson. Axelson had a problem. He had just received a shipment of a new type of ammunition, shells equipped with something the Army called the VT Fuze. The letters stood for variable time. The reality was far stranger than the name. Inside the nose of each shell was a tiny radio transmitter and receiver, powered by a battery so small it fit inside a tube the size of a thumb. When the shell was fired, the battery activated. The transmitter sent out a continuous radio signal. When that signal bounced off the ground and returned to the receiver at a strength that indicated the shell was between 30 and 50 feet above the surface, the fuse detonated the shell in midair. The effect was simple and annihilating. A conventional artillery shell buries itself in the ground before it explodes, and the earth absorbs a significant portion of the blast. Shrapnel flies up and out, but a man lying prone in a foxhole or a trench is below the spray. He is protected by the very ground that the shell just hit. The VT fuse eliminated that protection. The shell exploded above the ground, above the foxholes, above the trenches, and the shrapnel rained straight down. There was no cover. A man in a foxhole was no safer than a man standing upright. The mathematics of fragmentation inverted. Every lesson that every soldier on every front had learned about surviving artillery, dig in, get below ground level, let the earth protect you, became irrelevant in the time it took a radio signal to bounce off frozen soil and return to a fuse falling at terminal velocity. But here was Axelson's problem. The VT fuse was the most closely guarded secret in the Allied arsenal. General Eisenhower had personally restricted its use against ground targets, terrified that a dud round would be captured, disassembled, and reverse-engineered. The restriction had not yet been lifted. It was supposed to be released on Christmas Day, 9 days away. The 38th Cavalry was about to be overrun now. Axelson made his decision. He ordered his batteries to load the VT rounds and fire. What happened next is one of the most quietly devastating episodes in the history of artillery. The German infantry, advancing toward Monschau, was in the open, moving through snowy fields, crossing frozen ground without overhead cover. The American batteries fired a TOT mission with VT-fused shells. The shells arrived simultaneously. They detonated simultaneously. And they detonated in the air, 30 feet above the heads of men who had been trained since basic that the ground would save them. Within hours, Eisenhower lifted the restriction entirely. Within 2 days, every American artillery battalion in the Ardennes that had VT ammunition was using it. Now imagine you are a German soldier in the second week of the Ardennes offensive. You have been told this attack will reach the Meuse River in 4 days. You have been told the Americans are weak, spread thin, demoralized. You advance through a forest. Your officers tell you to move quickly, before the Americans regroup. And then the sky comes apart. There is no warning shot. There is no ranging round. The shells do not walk toward you the way Soviet shells walk. Left, right, closer, closer. They are simply there, all of them, in the same second, and they do not hit the ground. They hang in the air above you and burst, and the shrapnel falls like rain on a tin roof, except the tin roof is your helmet, your shoulders, the back of your neck. Your foxhole does not help. Your trench does not help. The log reinforcements over your position do not help because the fragments are coming from above the logs, not through them. German prisoners captured during the Bulge told interrogators that the airbursts were the worst thing they had experienced in the war. Some units refused orders to advance through areas that had been hit by the new shells. At Malmedy, attackers walked directly into the barrage with their hands raised, shouting, "Kamerad," because they had calculated that surrender was more survivable than continued exposure. By December 23rd, American intelligence estimated 2,000 German soldiers had been killed by VT-fused rounds alone. In 1 week. In one sector. And every one of those rounds arrived on target because of the same system that had made conventional TOT possible. The synchronized watches. The FDCs. The ability of a forward observer to call a grid coordinate and have every gun in range fire at a computed second, so that the VT-fused shells, which were devastating individually but apocalyptic in concentration, arrived not one at a time, giving men a chance to flatten, but all at once, giving men no chance at all. The VT fuse was the blade. TOT was the arm that swung it. And the watches, the cheap, mass-produced, hacking movement watches that ticked on the wrists of gun crews from Monschau to Bastogne, were the muscle and bone that held the arm together. General George Patton, not a man given to praising equipment he hadn't personally commanded, wrote to the Chief of Army Ordnance after the battle. "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us," he said. He was half right. The fuse was devastating. But without TOT, without the simultaneous arrival that maximized the killing window to its full theoretical lethality, the VT fuse was just a better shell. A better shell landing alone is still a shell landing alone. A man hears it, drops, and has a chance. 100 better shells landing in the same second is not artillery. It is erasure. And erasure required synchronization. And synchronization required watches. And watches required an industrial democracy that believed a corporal's time was as valuable as a colonel's. The question the German officers never asked, at least not in any interrogation transcript that survived the war, is the one that matters most. Not how do the Americans synchronize their artillery? They could see the effect. They could deduce the method. The question they never asked is, why can't we do the same thing? The answer begins in a factory in Elgin, Illinois, in 1942. Elgin Watch Company had been making timepieces since 1863. It was founded during the Civil War, when the Union Army needed watches, and the only alternative was importing them from Europe. By the 1930s, Elgin's factory floor was a machine for turning brass, steel, and glass into wrist-sized instruments at a rate that no European workshop could match. Not because the Swiss couldn't build better movements, they could, and did, but because the Swiss model was artisanal. A Swiss watchmaker was a craftsman who assembled movements by hand, fitted parts with tweezers under a loop, and produced watches in quantities measured in thousands. The American model was industrial. A floor of women, mostly women because their hands were smaller and steadier, assembled movements from interchangeable parts stamped by machines, and the quantities were measured in hundreds of thousands. When the War Department told Elgin, Waltham, Hamilton, and Bulova to build watches for the Army, these companies did not retool. They accelerated. They already knew how to mass-produce a 15-joule movement that kept time within 30 seconds a day. They already knew how to stamp a case from chrome-plated brass, not steel, because steel was needed for ships and tanks and guns, so the watch that won the war was built from the metal nobody else wanted. They already knew how to paint radium numerals on a black dial, so a man could read the time at 3 in the morning in a foxhole without striking a match. The government specification asked for exactly what they were already built to deliver, and they delivered more than 1 million. Germany had watchmakers. Germany had excellent watchmakers: Lang and Sona, Stova, Laco, Hanhart. But Germany did not have Elgin. It did not have a factory floor that could stamp out 100,000 watches in a quarter. It had workshops that could produce precision instruments in batches of a few thousand. And when those few thousand were distributed across the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine, there were never enough. The Wehrmacht's own records show the scale of the shortage. In Lublin, occupation authorities confiscated 800,000 wristwatches and sent them for repair and redistribution to frontline troops. 800,000 watches seized from an occupied population because the factories at home could not fill the gap. This is important. Hold it. Because it is not a story about watches. It is a story about what kind of country builds what kind of army. The United States in 1942 was a country that mass-produced things for ordinary people. Watches, radios, automobiles, refrigerators, telephones. The infrastructure of daily life was built on the assumption that a farmer in Iowa and a clerk in Manhattan and a mechanic in Alabama would all own the same categories of goods, manufactured to a standard, sold at a price, replaced when broken. The assembly line was not just an industrial method. It was a philosophy. Ordinary people deserve access to precision. Germany in 1942 was a country that mass-produced weapons brilliantly and consumer goods reluctantly. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece. The Me-262 jet fighter was a generation ahead of anything the Allies had in the air. But a wristwatch for every artilleryman was not a priority, because the German military system did not expect every artilleryman to need one. The battery commander had a watch. The battery commander gave the firing orders. The chain of command was vertical, and time flowed downward from the officer who possessed it to the men who obeyed him. This worked when one battery fired at one target on one command. It could not work when 16 battalions needed to fire at one target in the same second, because the second had to live on the wrist of every man at every gun, independently, simultaneously, without waiting for an officer to relay it. The American system was horizontal. Time was shared. Every man who touched a lanyard owned the same second as the colonel who authorized the mission. This was not an accident of logistics. It was a reflection of the country that built the army. A nation of mass production produced an army of mass synchronization. And the synchronization killed. The 4 divisions fighting on the northern shoulder of the Bulge made this visible in the starkest possible terms. They were supported by the fire of 348 guns and a battalion of 4.2-inch mortars. All of these weapons could be massed onto a single target by a single observer through the FDC network. 348 guns firing at computed seconds, shells converging from every direction, arriving in a 3-second window, and the men pulling the lanyards, privates, corporals, sergeants from places like Topeka and Scranton and Baton Rouge, knew what second to fire because each of them wore on his wrist a piece of American industry that cost less than a pair of boots. The German word was unfair, but unfair implies a rule that was broken. No rule was broken. The Americans simply answered a question the Germans never thought to ask. What happens when everyone knows what time it is? Hill 192 fell on July 11, 1944. The 2nd Infantry Division took the position after a coordinated assault preceded by the heaviest TOT concentration yet fired in the Normandy campaign. The German garrison, what remained of it, surrendered in groups, some still shaking from the concussions of the barrage. Interrogators noted that several prisoners had blood running from their ears, but no visible wounds. The pressure wave had done that. Not one shell. All of them, arriving at once. J. Lawton Collins, Lightning Joe, the man who had first proved TOT could work in the jungles of Guadalcanal, commanded 7th Corps through the breakout at Saint-Lô, the capture of Cherbourg, and the drive across France. His corps fired 140,000 rounds in coordinated strikes during Operation Cobra alone. After the war, he became Army Chief of Staff. He never wrote a memoir about the watches. He never needed to. The system he had helped build was so thoroughly absorbed into American artillery doctrine that it became invisible, like electricity, like running water, like all the things that only become visible when they stop working. Colonel George Axelson, the man who broke the VT Fuze embargo at Monschau, received no reprimand. He received a commendation. The cavalrymen he saved held their position. The northern shoulder of the bulge held with it. The Elgin Watch Company went back to making civilian timepieces after the war. So did Waltham, Hamilton, and Bulova. They had built more than 1 million watches for the military. But the Swiss caught up, and then passed them, and within 20 years the American watch industry, the industry that had put a synchronized second on the wrist of every gunner in the European theater, was gone. Elgin closed its factory in 1964. Waltham had already stopped manufacturing. Hamilton moved its production to Switzerland. The machines that had stamped brass cases by the thousand were scrapped or sold. The women who had assembled movements on the factory floor went home and never came back. The watches themselves ended up in footlockers, in dresser drawers, in cigar boxes, in attics across America. Some were returned to the Army, as regulations required. Most were kept. A veteran might open a drawer decades later and find a 32mm watch with a black dial and a cracked crystal, the radium numerals long faded to a pale ghost of their original glow, and remember nothing about it except that he wore it every day for 2 years, and that it kept pretty good time. He might not remember that it was synchronized every morning. He might not remember what TOT stood for. He might not remember the arithmetic, how the FDC calculated flight times backward from a designated second, how every battery fired at a different moment so every shell arrived at the same one. But the German officer who wrote the word unfair in his interrogation report remembered. He remembered because he had heard the result. He had heard nothing, and then he had heard everything. And the distance between those two sounds was the distance between an army that gave every man a watch and an army that did not. What American soldiers carried that German officers called unfair was not a weapon. It was a $2 timepiece with a hacking movement and a black dial. And it won the war 3 seconds at a time. Thank you for watching this one all the way through. If this story stays with you, if you didn't know that a wristwatch could change the way a war was fought, I'd be grateful if you'd hit the like button. It's a small thing, but it's how stories like this find the people who care about them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. There are more investigations like this one coming. Hit the bell so you don't miss them. I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in World War II, your father, your grandfather, your uncle, tell me about them in the comments. These stories belong to them. I just try to get them right.